I will tell you plainly that I am not a man who weeps easily. I am the younger son of the House of Ashcroft, and we are not, as a family, given to public sentiment. My brother Caspian, the 7th Duke of Ashcroft, the most feared peer in England, a man whose silence at a dinner table has been known to stop the conversation of 40 guests, once told me when I was 12 years old that tears were not forbidden in our family. They were simply unnecessary if one dealt with a problem quickly enough. I believe he meant it as comfort. I believe he was, in his way, trying to be kind. I have spent 37 years learning to translate my brother's silences and economies of feeling into the affection he rarely puts into plain English, and I have, I think, become rather good at it. I tell you this because, on a particular night in the 22nd year of our century, I stood in the entrance hall of Brackenwall House, in a gale of sleet that lashed the windows and turned the carriage road to black mud, and watched my brother Caspian, the most feared man in 3 counties, a man who had faced down creditors, duels, and a disastrous session of Parliament without the alteration of a single line on his face, fold a woman's hands in both of his, bow his head over them, and say, in a voice so quiet it was very nearly nothing, "You will not go back to that hall again, I promise you." I did weep then, not much, not visibly, but I did. This is the story of how we came to be standing in that entrance hall, in that gale, with my brother making a promise in 12 words that undid 40 years of carefully cultivated terror. It is not a short story. Alara Vane would not thank me for making it short, and neither, I think, would Caspian, though he would never say so. She came into our lives in November, which is, I have always thought, the cruelest month in England, not because it is the coldest, but because it pretends to be the last of autumn when it is already the first of winter, and the light fails at 4 in the afternoon as if it has simply given up. Caspian had been abroad since the spring, attending to certain business interests in Portugal, and then, for reasons he never fully explained to me, spending 6 weeks in the south of France doing nothing visible at all. He had returned 2 weeks before the events I mean to describe, still brown from the Mediterranean sun and considerably less inclined to speak than usual, which is saying something. He had come home to Ashcroft Hall, the family seat in Thornbury, and he had spent the first week of his return doing precisely what he always did when something was troubling him, managing the estate with terrifying efficiency, writing letters at his desk for 4 hours each morning, and writing alone in the afternoons until the light failed. I knew my brother was not well in himself, not ill, nothing of that kind, but unsettled in a way I had not seen since the year our father died, when Caspian was 22 and had to take the dukedom before he had expected to want it. I asked him once on the 3rd day of his return whether something had happened in France. He looked at me across the breakfast table with those dark gray eyes of his and said, "Nothing that requires discussion," which meant everything had happened, and he was deciding how much of it to carry alone. I did not press him. You do not press Caspian, not because he will refuse to answer, but because he will give you an answer so perfectly constructed to end the conversation that you will feel afterward as if you have learned nothing and yet been told quite a great deal. He is, in this as in most things, very good at being a duke. It was on the 9th day after his return, a Wednesday, raw and overcast, with rain that couldn't decide whether to be sleet, that a letter arrived which I happened to be present for. Caspian opened it at his desk while I was pretending to read the Morning Chronicle in the armchair by the fire. And I say pretending because I was in fact watching my brother the way one watches a barometer when the weather has been strange. Not in any expectation of drama, but in careful awareness that the instrument might be about to tell you something important. The instrument told me something important. He read the letter. He set it down. He was still for perhaps 3 seconds in a way that was entirely unlike his ordinary stillness, which is the stillness of a man who is always preparing his next precise move. This was a different kind of still, the kind that comes before something. Then he said, without looking at me, "When did Thomas Vane die?" Thomas Vane was the son of a Shropshire gentleman, a man of modest means and considerable charm, who had for 7 years been my brother's closest friend. Not a close friend in the way the ton understood friendship, not a hunting companion or a club associate, but a genuine one, the kind that is rare enough that Caspian, who trusted almost no one, trusted him completely. Thomas had been possessed of a fine mind, an irreverent wit, and the particular gift of making my brother laugh, which very few people in England were capable of. He had died 14 months before the events I am describing, of a fever that came on quickly and did not leave, 3 weeks from his first illness to his end, and Caspian had received the news in Portugal without sufficient time to return before the burial. I believe this had grieved him more than he would ever say. April, I said, April of last year. Caspian looked at the letter again, and his widow. I had not thought about Mrs. Vane since the summer, not from callousness, but from the ordinary way that a woman one has met twice becomes, after her husband's death, a name attached to a memory rather than a real presence. She had been a quiet person, I recalled, a woman of perhaps 25 at the time of their marriage, 5 years before. She had kind eyes and a composure that struck me as earned rather than natural, as if she had learned to be calm the way some people learn a second language with effort and practice, and the intention of making it look effortless. She had not been beautiful in the way that London considered beauty, which is to say she had not been fair-haired and fashionably languid. She had been something quieter and, I thought, more durable. I had liked her. I had not known her. I believe she is in Shropshire, I said, with Thomas's family, or she was. Caspian handed me the letter. It was from his solicitor in London, a man named Hatch, who was meticulous and grim and had served the Ashcroft family for 20 years. The letter was 3 pages long. I will not quote it in full. I will only tell you what it said. Thomas Vane had died with debts, not scandalous debts, not gambling or dissolution, but the ordinary grinding kind that come from a modest income and an optimistic nature. Improvements to the family property he had inherited from his father, loans taken out against rents that had not materialized, a merchant's credit that had been extended too generously. In his lifetime, these debts had been manageable, not comfortable, but manageable. His death had made them unmanageable. His estate was smaller than the obligations attached to it. Thomas's elder brother, Reginald Vane, a man whom, I will say plainly, I had always found disagreeable in a way I could not precisely articulate, had inherited the estate and promptly decided that his late brother's widow was an asset to be managed. Elara Vane had no family fortune of her own. Her small widow's portion had been absorbed into the general tangle of the estate's obligations. She was, in Reginald Vane's accounting, a liability. She required housing, required maintenance, and had no immediate prospect of remarriage because, as Reginald had apparently communicated to various people, she was not remarkable enough for a man of consequence to want her, and not poor enough for a man of modest means to find her advantageous. He had therefore done what Hatch's letter, with professional restraint, described as an arrangement. He had sold Thomas's outstanding debts, all of them at a discount, to a single creditor, Baron Holt of Brackenwall House, some 12 miles from the Vane property. Baron Holt was 53 years old. He had been married twice before. Both wives had died, the second in circumstances that were not discussed in polite society and not, as far as I knew, properly investigated. He was a man of considerable wealth and no particular character, except that he was known to be acquisitive and entirely without sentiment. Hatch's letter informed us that Baron Holt had made his intentions plain to Reginald Vane. In exchange for the debts, he wished to marry Elara. The marriage was to take place within the fortnight. Reginald had agreed. Mrs. Vane had been informed. She had not, so far as Hatch's information extended, been consulted. I read the letter twice. When I looked up from it, my brother was standing at the window with his back to me, looking out at the rain, and there was something in the line of his shoulders that I had not seen there before, or had not seen for a very long time, something coiled, almost contained, as if a great deal was being held in check by considerable effort. Hatch asks, I said carefully, whether we wish to take any action. He notes that the legal situation is, well, that it is not improper, strictly speaking. The debts are legitimate, and the transfer is legitimate, and the marriage, if she agrees to it. She has agreed to nothing, Caspian said. She has been presented with the arrangement and not consulted. There's a difference, I said, between not being consulted and being forced. Is there? It was not a question. He turned from the window and looked at me, and I read his face the way I have always read it, in the negative space, in what was not there rather than what was. There was no anger visible. There rarely was with Caspian when the anger was genuine rather than tactical. There was only a very precise and very careful attention, as if he were examining something and determining exactly what it would cost to fix it. I am going to call on the Vane household, he said. Today. I set down the letter, Caspian. You may come if you like, he said, and he reached for his coat. I came. The Vane property, Aldermore, a moderate house in gray stone, was 12 miles from Ashcroft Hall, and the road between them was not a good one in November. We made it in just over an hour, in the closed carriage, with sleet on the windows and the kind of silence between us that my brother produced when he was thinking hard about several things at once and did not wish to be interrupted. I did not interrupt him. I looked out the window at the hedgerows going gray and tried to think about what I actually knew of Alara Vane, which was embarrassingly little. I knew she had married Thomas 7 years ago, which would make her now, I calculated, 32 perhaps. Thomas had been 3 years older than that. I knew she had moved to Aldermore with him at their marriage and had been there since. I knew she had never had children, which in the society we inhabited was considered a point against her, though I had always thought this a peculiarly unkind calculation. I knew she had kept Thomas's household and helped him manage the property in the last 2 years of his life when he had been less than perfectly well. And I knew, because Thomas had once told me, laughing, in the way he had of making serious things sound light, that she was the cleverest woman I have ever met, and the only one who makes me feel that is a compliment rather than a curiosity. Reginald Vane received us in the drawing-room of Aldermore with the particular manner of a man who knows he has done something his betters will not like, and has decided to be aggressively unashamed of it. He was 6 years older than Thomas had been, heavier, with a face that looked as if it had once been better looking, and had settled into dissatisfaction. He offered us tea with a heartiness that did not reach his eyes, and congratulated Caspian on his return from the continent, with the smoothness of a man who has rehearsed his response to trouble. Caspian accepted the tea, set it down untouched, and said, in a voice of absolute pleasantness, "I should like to speak with Mrs. Vane, if I may." Reginald's eyes shifted. "Alara is, she keeps to herself, your grace. The arrangement has been, a great deal has happened, and she's not receiving." "I am not proposing a social call," Caspian said. "I am proposing that you send for her." It was the tone. I have heard my brother use it 3 or 4 times in my life, and it never fails to produce the same effect. The person it is directed at finds themselves sending for Mrs. Vane. She came into the drawing-room 5 minutes later, and I want to describe her carefully because it matters. She was wearing a plain gray dress, good fabric but subdued, nothing that declared anything about itself, and her dark hair was put up simply, a little loose at the temples, as if she had been doing something practical before she was summoned and had not had occasion to be ornamental. There was a small ink stain on the outside of her right forefinger, which I noticed because it is the kind of thing I notice, and which told me she had been writing when we arrived, letters, or accounts, or whatever it is a woman manages alone at a desk when the managing has fallen entirely to her. She was 32, as I had calculated, and she looked it in the best sense. Not faded, not diminished, but settled into herself in the way that some women do at that age, as if they have finished becoming and have now simply arrived. She had what I can only describe as a quality of stillness that was not resignation. It was something older and more considered than that, a stillness that had been acquired rather than inherited, that knew exactly how much it was costing. She was not pretty in the way that Regency drawing rooms consider pretty. She was something better than that. She was a woman whose face told the truth about her without apology, and the truth was that she was more interesting than the room she was standing in, and had been for a very long time, and had learned to be discreet about it. She looked at Reginald first, then she looked at me, then she looked at my brother. And I, watching, which is my role in these events, saw something happen to Caspian's face that I have never quite been able to find words for. Not an expression, exactly. He was too trained for that. But a quality changed in him, in the region of his jaw and his eyes, as if something that had been braced against the world briefly released. It was the briefest of things, a second perhaps less. Then he was entirely himself again, composed, measuring, contained, and he rose, which surprised me because Caspian does not rise unnecessarily, and he said, "Mrs. Vane, I am very sorry for the loss of Thomas. He was a man I valued beyond my ability to express it." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said very quietly, "He said the same of you, your grace." Reginald Vane was still in the room. It is the sort of thing one forgets when Caspian speaks. We sat, tea was poured and ignored. Caspian, and this was precise, I understood it as deliberate, addressed himself to Alara and not to Reginald, which was a choice with consequences, because it made the conversation her conversation rather than a negotiation over her head. And Reginald could see exactly what was happening, and could do nothing about it without becoming visibly rude to a duke. "I understand," Caspian said, "that an arrangement has been made regarding the outstanding obligations on the Aldermore estate." Alara said, "Yes. I understand that Baron Holt has acquired those obligations." "Yes, and that the Baron has proposed, as the condition of their resolution, a marriage." A pause. "He has indicated that a marriage would satisfy the debt. Have you been offered the opportunity to refuse?" The pause this time was longer. She looked at her hands in her lap, and then she looked up at my brother, and she said, with a composure that must have cost her considerably, "I have been told that it is the most practical course." "That is not what I asked." Silence, and then, "No, I have not been offered the opportunity to refuse." Caspian looked at Reginald Vane, who had been examining the fireplace with great apparent interest. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds and contained, as nearly as I have ever been able to reconstruct it, a polite but total annihilation. Reginald's color changed. "Thank you, Mrs. Vane," Caspian said. "I am sorry to have asked you to say that plainly. I believe it needed to be said." He rose, she rose, and he offered her his hand, not in the social manner, not as one offers a hand to a woman leaving a room, but as one offers it to a person whom one has just asked to confirm something painful, and who deserves the acknowledgement of a hand rather than nothing. She took it, held it for exactly the right length of time, released it. "I will call again," Caspian said, "if I may." She looked at him for a moment with those careful eyes of hers. "You may," she said. On the road back to Ashcroft Hall, in the closed carriage with the sleet coming sideways and the darkness coming early, my brother was quiet for a very long time. I let the quiet go on. I am, as I have said, practiced at this. We were perhaps 3 miles from home when he said, without inflection, "Hatch will need to know the total of the obligations." "Yes," I said. "All of them, not just the principal. The interest accrued, the legal costs, everything Holt paid for the right to acquire them." "I'll write to Hatch tonight," I said. Another silence. The rain had turned to sleet proper now, and I could hear it against the carriage roof. "She was not afraid," Caspian said then. It was not addressed to me precisely. It was the kind of statement that is addressed to the interior of a man's own thinking. She was not resigned either. She had worked out exactly what she had and what she did not have, and she was managing it. She was managing it entirely alone. I said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would improve on his observation. "Thomas would have hated this," he said. "He would have hated every part of it." "Yes," I said, "he would have." And then my brother was quiet again, and I looked out the window at the hedgerows and the dark, and I thought, we are going to fix this. He has not yet decided all the particulars of how we are going to fix this, but we are going to fix it, and the word we have not said yet is that whatever it costs, he will pay it. I thought, too, about what I had seen in the drawing room. Alara Vane's hands folded in her lap with a composure that was, I now understood, something she had been making herself do for months, and my brother's face as he watched her across the tea table, and the particular quality of his attention, the kind he brings to problems he intends to solve, except that this was not quite the face of a man solving a problem. It was something else. It was the face of a man who has recognized something. I had known Caspian for 37 years, and I had watched him recognize many things: a flaw in an argument, an opportunity in an estate lease, a weakness in a parliamentary position, and he always looked the same when he did. Exact, focused, a little more still than his ordinary stillness. He had looked at Alara Vane, and he had looked like that, and then he had looked, for just a moment, like something quite different from it. Something I did not have a name for because I had not seen it before on his face. The sleet on the carriage roof was steady now. I pulled my coat closer and decided to write to Hatch in the morning before breakfast so that the letter would be on its way by the time my brother came down. Hatch's accounting, which arrived 3 days later, was considerable. Baron Holt had acquired Thomas Vane's outstanding obligations for £1,140, a figure that included the original debts, the interest, and a handsome premium that Reginald Vane had negotiated as his own fee for arranging the transfer. The total Holt had paid was not the total it would cost to satisfy him. Holt, Hatch informed us, was not negotiating. He had made plain to his own solicitors that the arrangement was settled and the marriage would proceed. and that if any party attempted to interfere, he would pursue the matter through every legal avenue available to him. Hatch's estimate of what it would cost to satisfy Holt completely, to pay every obligation, retire every legal claim, and remove him from the arrangement entirely, was £1,400. Caspian read the figures. He folded Hatch's letter. He said, "Reply that I will call on Hatch on Friday." I said, "Caspian." He looked at me. £1,400, I said. It is a great deal. I am aware of what £1,400 is, Edmund. That is not what I mean, I said. I mean, what are you doing? What do you intend? Because if you propose to retire her debts and hand her back to Reginald Vane to find another solution, that is money spent on nothing. And if you propose to— I stopped. I looked at my brother, who was watching me with perfect patience, and I said more carefully, "What are you proposing?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that means he is deciding how much to say. "I propose," he said finally, "to remove her from a situation she did not choose and that Thomas would not have permitted if he had been alive to prevent it." "And after that?" "After that is not your concern yet," he said, not unkindly. "After that depends on a number of things that are not yet determined." It was the truest thing he had said, and I believe he meant it in more than the practical sense. He called on Alara Vane twice in the fortnight that followed. I went with him both times, which is to say I sat in the drawing-room of Aldermore and made conversation with Reginald Vane's unfortunate wife, a pale, tired woman named Agnes who had married Reginald 6 years ago and now gave every impression of having concluded that the arrangement had been suboptimal, while my brother sat with Alara in the window bay near the cold garden, talking. I will say this for Agnes Vane. She was a woman of considerable endurance and very little complaint, and she made conversation with me on both visits with the pleasant efficiency of someone who is grateful for a distraction from her domestic circumstances. We talked about the winter, about the roads, about a novel she had been reading. She had a dry, quiet wit under the tiredness, and I thought she was rather wasted on Reginald. But I could not, in truth, attend entirely to Agnes, because the drawing-room was not large, and my position on the settee afforded me a full view of the window bay, and I watched my brother sit with Alara Vane and talk to her the way I had never, in 37 years, watched him talk to anyone. Caspian in company was formidable and correct and thorough, and never, to my knowledge, relaxed in the way that most men are relaxed with someone they like. He was attentive and accurate and kind in a way that cost him something rather than costing him nothing, because kindness does not come naturally to people who are built to manage large things. But with Alara, in those 2 visits, something different was happening. He was— the only word I have for it is easy. He was easy in a way I could count on one hand across his lifetime. He leaned forward, he listened. In the first visit, she had begun with the particular careful courtesy of a woman receiving a guest she respects and is not certain she trusts, which is entirely understandable. And by the middle of it, she had stopped being careful in that way, and I watched the shift happen without being able to catch the moment, only the before and the after. She became, from one paragraph of conversation to the next, less managed, not less composed. That was not a thing that happened to her by degrees. But less defended, as if she had made some internal calculation and arrived at a provisional conclusion. In the second visit, she argued with him. I could not hear the substance, something about the management of an estate or possibly the management of tenants. I caught a phrase about drainage rights. But I could see her make a point with her hands and watch Caspian receive it with the expression of a man who has just been told something he did not know and finds the experience agreeable rather than the reverse. He answered. She answered back. He tilted his head at an angle that meant he was considering whether she was right, which, in my brother, is the highest form of engagement. Once she said something, I could not catch what, and he laughed briefly with his head turned to the window. A genuine laugh that he caught before it became very visible, and then looked back at her as if surprised by himself. I thought of what Thomas had said, years before, about a conversation I had had with him on this very topic. Thomas had told me, laughing in that way of his that made serious things sound manageable, that his wife argued with him as an equal and agreed with him as an ally and did both without needing his approval of either. He had meant it as a warmth. I understood now, watching my brother lean forward in the window bay with winter light on his face, why a man would find that specifically undoing. Particularly a man like Caspian, who had spent 20 years being correct in rooms full of people who agreed with him. and who found, apparently, that being argued with by a woman with an ink stain on her forefinger, and a quality of absolute precision, was something he had been waiting for without knowing it. On the second visit, as we were preparing to leave and Alara was saying goodbye with the composed politeness that was her register for everything, Caspian paused at the door and said, very quietly, "The situation will be resolved before the date Holt has set. I am sorry I cannot tell you more than that yet." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I believe you." He did not say anything further. He put on his coat. We went out into the cold. On the road home, I said, after perhaps a mile of silence, "You are in love with her." He did not answer for long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. Then he said, "That is a very direct observation, Edmund." "You are my brother," I said, "and I have 37 years of practice at reading you, and you are in love with her. And she was Thomas's wife, and you have had whatever is happening in you in France and wherever else for however long, and you have come home and found her in this situation, and you are going to pay £1,400, and you need to decide what you are actually doing, because there is." "I know what I am doing," he said. The quiet that followed was of a different kind. Not thinking, not managing, just inhabited. "She deserves the choice," he said, finally. "She has not been given any choices about anything in the last 14 months. The first thing I can do, the only first thing, is give her back the ability to say no." I thought about that for a moment, and if she says no. He looked out the window. Then she will be free to say no, that is the point. We were 9 days from the date Baron Holt had set for the marriage when Caspian received a letter from Hatch informing him that Holt had moved the date forward. The reasons given were administrative, something about witnesses and a license, but the practical effect was clear enough. We had 4 days, where we had expected 10. Caspian read the letter at breakfast. He read it again, he set it down. "Edmund," he said, "send a message to Dunbar. I will need the pair of bays tonight." Dunbar was our head groom. The bays were the fastest horses in the Ashcroft stable, which was a stable that had not had cause to be fashionable in years because it had been built purely for function. The bays were the kind of function that means you intend to cover ground quickly in uncertain weather. "Tonight," I said. "Holt has his own solicitors and he has been filing the required notices in advance," Caspian said. "Reginald Vane has cooperated at every stage. If we wait until we can negotiate through channels," he stopped. "We have 4 days and we cannot trust 4 days. We need to be in front of this before it is finished." He paused. "I am going to call on Baron Holt directly." "At Brackenwall." "At Brackenwall," he said. "Tonight, if the roads permit. I will not negotiate this at a remove." I looked at my brother across the breakfast table, and I thought, here it is. Here is the thing he has been building toward since the moment he read Hatch's first letter and went still in that particular way. "I am coming with you," I said. He did not argue. He just nodded once and reached for his coffee. The weather that night was the kind that Shropshire and the counties around it produce in mid-November with a cheerful indifference to anyone's schedule. A gale out of the north, sleet coming in horizontal bursts, the roads soft from a week of rain, and the temperature dropping fast enough that the mud was beginning to crust at the edges. It was not, I will say plainly, the night for a pair of fine horses and a closed carriage on 12 miles of uncertain road. We went anyway. Caspian did not speak much on the road, but it was a different silence from his earlier ones. Those had been the silence of a man deciding. This one was the silence of a man who had decided. It has a different quality, steadier, almost quiet in a way the thinking silences are not, as if some central gear has engaged and the machine is simply running. I sat across from him in the carriage as the sleet hit the windows and the horses labored through a section of road where the mud had gone soft, and I thought about what I was watching. I have attended my brother through a great many things. The death of our father, the first year of the dukedom when he was 22, and the weight of it was visible in the new lines on his face. A period of illness some years ago. A miserable winter when the estate finances had required surgical attention, and he had provided it with the grimness of a surgeon who operates without anesthesia because the alternative is worse. I had watched him manage Parliament and tenants and creditors, and the particular machinery of being a feared man in a world that wants something from you. I had never watched him do this. I had never watched him go through a gale in a carriage, not for any of those other things, not with that particular quality of settled, absolute intention. We were 2 miles from Brackenwall when the carriage stopped. One of the bays had thrown a shoe on a stretch of rutted road. It was nobody's fault, just the night's particular malice, and our coachman told us so apologetically through the window. We could continue at a walk, he said. We could turn back, or... We continue, Caspian said. He looked at the carriage lamp, and then he opened the door and stepped down into the sleet. What are you doing? I said. Walking, he said, and buttoned his coat. So we walked the last 2 miles to Brackenwall House through the sleet, following the carriage as it went carefully on a lame horse. And I will tell you that the road in November in Shropshire in a gale is not a pleasant experience. But I will also tell you that my brother walked it without a word of complaint at a pace that kept me moving briskly to stay level with him, and I did not hear him mention the weather once. Brackenwall House was a large, square building of red brick, prosperous and entirely without charm, which I thought was rather a true rendering of its owner. The lights were on in the lower windows, gold against the wet dark, and there was smoke from several chimneys, the smell of coal and damp stone as we came up the drive. The whole aspect of the place was that of a house that has been built to impress and has succeeded only at the impression of wealth rather than the impression of anything finer. It was past 9 o'clock in the evening, which is not a calling hour, and the footman who opened the door to us had the look of a man who has been managing a household that runs smoothly and has just been confronted with something that will require him to improvise. He looked at us, 2 men in mud-splashed coats, one of them damp enough to be leaving prints on the stone step, and then he looked past us at the carriage with a lame horse, and his expression arranged itself into the kind of careful neutrality that good household staff produce when they need to think quickly. Caspian handed the man his card, his actual card, the one with the crest on it, which he uses when he means to be unambiguous rather than polite, and said, "Kindly inform Baron Holt that the Duke of Ashcroft wishes to speak with him on a matter of some urgency. Tonight." The man looked at the card. He looked at us. One of us soaked and mud-spattered, the other considerably more composed despite being equally soaked and mud-spattered. He went away and came back within 2 minutes. "His lordship will see you in the library," he said. We were shown through a hallway that was decorated with the particular excess of a man who has acquired things to demonstrate that he has acquired them. A quantity of portraits of people who were probably not ancestors, candlesticks that were too large for their tables, carpets that had been expensive, and had not aged the way expensive carpets age when they are chosen with care rather than with money. My brother walked through it without looking at any of it, because he is a man who has never needed to fill space with objects, and has therefore never developed the habit of noticing when other men do. Baron Holt was a large man who had the look of someone who had been imposing in his youth, and now, in his 50s, merely occupied a great deal of space. He was standing by the fireplace when we entered, and he had arranged himself in the way that men who are accustomed to having things arrange themselves to their convenience arrange themselves, with a deliberate negligence, as if the hour and the conditions of our arrival were irrelevant to him. He was, I noted, also not entirely without witnesses. There was another man in the room, introduced to us as his solicitor Granger, who was perched on a chair near the writing table with a sheaf of papers and an alert expression. Caspian noted the solicitor, said nothing about him, and said to Holt, "Thank you for seeing me tonight." "I apologize for the hour." Holt looked at him. He was, I will say, not a stupid man. He read the room correctly enough to understand that when the Duke of Ashcroft comes to your library at 9 in the evening soaked from a 2-mile walk through a gale, he is not there for a social call, and he has not brought his own solicitor. "I confess I am curious, Your Grace, what brings you to Brackenwall on such a night?" "The estate obligations of the late Thomas Vane," Caspian said. He sat down, which I found interesting because Holt had not offered a seat, and settled himself as if the chair were his. "Specifically, the sum of £1,140 which you acquired from Reginald Vane some weeks ago, with the understanding that a marriage to Thomas Vane's widow would constitute their resolution." Holt's expression shifted in a way that was not quite satisfaction and not quite calculation, but something between. "That is a private arrangement," he said, "between myself and Mr. Reginald Vane." "It involves Mrs. Vane," Caspian said, "which makes it less private than you may have intended." "Mrs. Vane has been informed of the arrangement." "I am aware," Caspian said pleasantly, "that she has been informed. I am also aware that she has not agreed to it in any formal sense, and that the date of the proposed ceremony has been brought forward in a manner that has not given her opportunity to consider her position. Holt looked at him with the particular expression of a man who knows he is about to lose something he expected to keep, and is determining how much of that is negotiable. "Mrs. Vane's position," he said, "is determined by the obligations attached to her late husband's estate. I hold those obligations. The arrangement is straightforward." "The arrangement," Caspian said, "will be superseded." Silence, the fire crackled. The solicitor Granger looked up from his papers. "I beg your pardon," Holt said. Caspian reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He placed it on the table between them. "This is a banker's draft. It represents the full outstanding obligations of the Vane estate, principal, interest, and the premium you paid Reginald Vane for the right of acquisition. £1,400. It is dated today and drawn on Ashcroft's account at Drummond's." Holt looked at the document. He did not touch it. "If you accept it," Caspian said, "the obligations are retired in full. Every claim you hold against the Vane estate and by extension against Mrs. Vane is dissolved. She is free." The silence that followed was of a kind that I have only encountered a few times in my life. The kind that comes after a statement which has changed the room, and everyone in it knows the room has changed, but no one has yet said so. Holt said slowly, "You are proposing to pay Vane's debts." "I have proposed it," Caspian said. "The draft is there." "And in exchange?" My brother looked at him for a moment without any expression at all. "There is no exchange," he said. "I am not buying something. I am retiring an obligation in full at the correct price according to the terms attached to it. There is nothing to negotiate." Holt's jaw tightened. "The arrangement with Mrs. Vane." "The arrangement with Mrs. Vane," Caspian said, "was predicated on the outstanding obligations being in your possession. If the obligations are retired, there is no arrangement. There is nothing to base an arrangement on." He paused. "Your solicitor, I think, will confirm this." Granger, from his chair, had the somewhat uncomfortable expression of a man who has been produced as a witness and is finding himself witnessing something somewhat larger than anticipated. He cleared his throat. "The obligations are, the arrangement is, in legal terms, contingent on the outstanding debt, if the debt is retired by a third party." "Then the arrangement concludes," Caspian said. He looked at Holt. "I believe that is correct, is it not, Granger?" Granger looked at his papers. He looked at Holt. He looked at the banker's draft on the table. "That is, yes, that would be the legal reading." Holt looked at my brother for a long moment. I have tried to describe what Caspian looked like in that moment, and I find I keep returning to the same inadequate word, steady. He was steady. He sat in the chair that had not been offered to him, in a coat that was still damp at the shoulders from a 2-mile walk through a gale, and he was the stillest and most settled thing in the room, and Holt, who was used to being the most imposing figure in any negotiation, was visibly, silently aware of it. "You are paying Vane's debts," Holt said again, as if saying it once more might change its meaning. "I am retiring the obligations of a woman who was not given the opportunity to refuse an arrangement made over her head," Caspian said. "I am doing so because it is the correct thing to do." He paused. "That is the only reason I am offering you." Another silence. Then Baron Holt reached out and picked up the banker's draft. He looked at it. He looked at his solicitor. He looked at my brother one more time, and I think he looked for something that would give him purchase, some ambition or calculation he could recognize, and found nothing he recognized. "Very well," he said. He sounded, and I believe this was genuine, rather deflated. "Have your solicitor draft the release documents. I will sign them." Caspian stood. "Hatch will call on you tomorrow morning," he said. "Thank you for your time, Baron Holt." He was already moving toward the door when Holt said, in a different tone, the tone of a man who is not quite finished, "I wonder, Your Grace, what your interest in the matter is. Mrs. Vane is a modest woman of no particular connection. She is not, forgive me, the kind of person one might expect a duke to go to." He paused, clearly looking for a construction that would be offensive enough to satisfy something in him without being openly rude. Caspian stopped at the door. He turned around, and he looked at Holt with those dark gray eyes of his in the way that I have seen once or twice, in 37 years, when something has pushed him past the boundary of the careful. "Mrs. Vane," he said very quietly, "was the wife of the best man I have known. She managed his household and his property and his illness with a quality of dignity that most people in my acquaintance could not have managed a day of. She has been treated since his death as a figure in someone else's accounting rather than a person with the right to her own conclusions. My interest in the matter," he stopped, and for a moment the room was entirely still, "is that it is past time she was treated differently." He held Holt's gaze for exactly the right number of seconds. Then he turned and went out. I followed him. I am very good at following my brother out of rooms. We did not go directly to Alara that night. The road was still grim, the hour was past 10, and there were legal documents to be prepared and signed before any of it was properly settled. Caspian had arranged with Hatch, who was a man of immense competence and very little visible alarm, to have the release documents drafted and countersigned the following morning, which they were, Holt being apparently a man who, once he had decided to accept a reversal, accepted it efficiently. By noon the next day, the obligations were fully retired. By evening, a copy of the release documents had been dispatched to Reginald Vane, whose response, as relayed by his solicitor, was so precisely the kind of response one makes when one has been outmaneuvered and knows it that I will not quote it in full. It contained, in essence, a great deal of formal acquiescence and nothing at all gracious. On the afternoon of the third day, Caspian and I went to Aldermore. The weather had broken overnight. It was still cold, sharp, and clear, with a low winter sun that made the frost on the hedgerows look like something considered rather than accidental. The roads were passable. We went in the smaller carriage, the one without the crest on the door, which Caspian chooses sometimes when he wants to arrive somewhere without announcing himself in advance. Reginald Vane was not at home when we called. His wife Agnes received us with a look of someone who had recently been informed that a great deal of money had changed hands over her husband's head, and was feeling the complicated feelings of a person who has not decided whether to be relieved or nervous. She was, I thought, probably both. She sent for Alara. We waited in the same drawing room, the same winter light, the same settee. It was extraordinary how familiar the room had become in such a short time. Alara came in. She was wearing the same gray dress. It was, I thought, not the only dress she owned, but she had arranged herself in whatever offered the most composure, and composure was her primary dress. She looked at Caspian first, and then at me, and I could see her reading the room the way she always did, quickly, accurately, without asking. "Sit down," Caspian said. "Please, I have something to tell you." He sat across from her. I stood near the window because there is a moment in some conversations where one does not belong in a chair. He told her plainly, the obligations had been retired. The Baron's arrangement was dissolved. She was, from a legal standpoint, free of the debt and all claims attendant on it. He told her plainly, and he watched her face as he told her, and I watched both of them. She was very still for a moment after he finished. Then she said, "How?" "Directly," he said. "I mean," she stopped. She had very good control of herself. Even now, with something working in her that I could see but could not name, she was not excessive about it. "You paid it." "I retired the obligations, yes." "All of it. All of it." She was quiet for a moment. There was something in her expression that I have thought about since, trying to find the right word for it. It was not relief exactly, or not only relief. It was the expression of a person who has been holding a tremendous weight alone for a very long time, and has just been told they can set it down, and who is in the process of realizing both how heavy it was, and that they do not have to pretend it was not. She said, finally, "I don't know what to, you have given me a great deal more than I knew how to ask for, Your Grace." "You did not ask for it," he said. "You did not ask me for anything. I want to be clear about that. What I did because I chose to, not as a transaction." She looked at him. "Then I am grateful," she said, "more than I know how to express." There was a silence. It was the kind of silence that has a shape to it that is about something other than silence. "And Reginald," she said then. I had not expected the question, and I do not think my brother had either. It was the practical question, the one that cut to the thing she had been managing while the relief was still moving through her. "He has been informed," he cannot. "He has received the release documents through his solicitor," Caspian said. "He has no further legal claim on the Aldermore estate's obligations, and neither does Baron Holt. The property itself reverts to its original standing." He paused. "He is still your brother-in-law, and that position is unchanged. but the financial instrument he was holding against you is gone. She absorbed this. I watched her absorb it in the way she absorbed everything. Not quickly, not with visible emotion, but with the thoroughness of someone who has learned that incomplete understanding costs more than the time it takes to understand completely. He will not be pleased, she said. No, Caspian agreed, he will not. He will find another way to make things difficult if he can. He may try, my brother said. He will find it considerably more difficult to do so, with a Duke of Ashcroft's interest in the matter placed on record. I watched Alara look at him at those words, and I watched something move in her face that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, and was altogether something more private than either. Something that was, I thought, the first thing she had let herself feel that had not been immediately organized into usefulness. You are, she said very quietly, rather more than I expected, Your Grace. My brother looked at her in that way of his, the way I had been cataloging since the morning he read Hatch's first letter. And what did you expect? He said. She considered this with genuine attention, which was, I was beginning to understand, how she considered everything. A kindness for Thomas's sake, she said, which would have been more than sufficient, and would have been entirely sufficient reason to be grateful. But this is something rather more than a kindness for Thomas's sake. She looked at him steadily. Isn't it? It was not quite a question. Caspian met her gaze and held it, and I had the sudden conviction that I was watching two very precise people arrive at the edge of something and decide, with perfect mutual awareness, to be careful with it. It is, he said simply. She nodded once, and then, as if she had settled something internally that she needed to settle before the next thing, she said, Then I thank you for it. For what it actually was, rather than what it would have been sufficient to call it. There was a silence. It was the kind of silence that has a shape to it that is about something other than silence. Caspian looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at her, and I believe this was the hardest thing he said, because he did not say hard things easily, and this was very direct, and direct was not his natural register. I would like, if you are willing, to continue to call on you, not as a continuation of today's arrangement, simply because I would like to. She looked at him for a long moment. Simply, she said. Yes. Your Grace, she said, and there was something very quiet in her voice, something that was not a deflection. I am not quite able to think about what simply means at this particular moment. I have been told for rather a long time that my value was primarily in relation to an obligation, that what I was worth was what could be extracted from me or laid against a debt or resolved. And I have, she stopped. She was still. I have managed. I am good at managing. But I am not, at this moment, certain what I want or who I am outside of managing. I know, Caspian said. She looked at him. That is why I said simply, he said. Not because it is a small thing, because it is the opposite. It requires no resolution and no transaction and no particular outcome on your part. Simply means that I would like to call on you, and you may say no, and if you say no, I will accept it entirely. And if you say yes, I will come back on Thursday and we will talk about whatever you like, and there is nothing you owe me for today or ever. The winter sun was going orange in the window. Agnes's clock on the mantelpiece ticked. She looked at him for a very long time, long enough that I began to wonder whether the answer was going to be no, and to think about how my brother would receive it. Not badly, I thought. He had meant what he said about no. He would receive it as the thing it was, the choice she deserved to make given back to her. Thursday, Alara said at last. If that suits, he said. Thursday suits, she said. He called on Thursday. And the Thursday after that, and the one after that. I went the first 2 times. After that, I began to find that I had other business in the afternoon, because there is a kind of call that no longer requires a witness, and I knew by the 3rd week that we had arrived there. What I can tell you, because I was there for the first 2 and heard enough afterward to reconstruct the arc, is this. They talked. They talked the way 2 people talk when they are both intelligent and both careful and both aware that something is happening between them that requires a great deal more care than most things. She told him about Thomas, the good years and the difficult ones, the quality of his mind, the particular grief of watching someone diminish who had been so very much themselves. He listened the way Caspian listens to things that matter, entirely without interruption, without manufacturing comfort. He told her about Portugal and France, not, I think, everything, but enough to make the months of his restlessness intelligible. She listened. It was, I gathered from what Caspian allowed to reach me, a courtship of unusual character. It had none of the conventional machinery, no formal calls announced through a third party, no flowers sent by proxy, no calculated appearances at events. It was two people talking. And talking is not a small thing between two people who think as precisely as they both thought. It is, in fact, the most direct road available. He came home from the third Thursday with a book under his arm, one she had lent him. He said, a history of agricultural reform that she had been annotating in the margins, which he had apparently read in a single evening, and which he then, over the following week, annotated in response to her annotations in a different ink. He brought it back on the fourth Thursday. I do not know what was said when he did, but he came home from that visit with a look I had not seen on him before, a look of someone who has been caught doing something slightly more tender than they intended, and is not, in the event, unhappy about it. She sent him a letter in December. I know this because I happened to be in the entrance hall when it arrived, and I recognized the handwriting on the direction, precise, unornamented, the handwriting of someone who writes to communicate rather than to make an impression. And I did not look at it for longer than a second, because it was not mine to look at. But I will say that Caspian read it in the library that evening and was, afterward, the most settled he had been since November. By Christmas, which Alara spent with distant cousins in Shropshire, Caspian was quieter at home than he had been, which was, I had learned, his version of something occupying him completely. He rode in the afternoons and read at night, and managed the estate with his usual surgical precision, and once or twice I caught him looking at something that was not quite in the room. At dinner on Christmas Eve, just the two of us, which was our habit in years when neither of us had particular plans, he said, entirely without preamble, Thomas once told me that she read Cicero in the original Latin for amusement. I put down my fork. Did he? He said she found it restful. Caspian looked at his wine. He said she had never told anyone else because she didn't want to make it a performance. We sat with that for a moment. She's remarkable, I said. Yes, Caspian said. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. On the 30th of December, 3 days before the new year, he came into the library where I was attempting to sort through some correspondence and said, without preamble, I am going to ask her to marry me. I looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and a look of someone who has arrived at a conclusion after a very long time of examining it and is now simply certain. When, I said, when she is ready to hear it, which is not yet. He paused. She needs more time than I have had, Edmund. She had years of managing and not being asked and being told what she was worth. She needs time to be something other than that. You are very sure about this, I said. He looked at me. I have never, he said, been more certain of anything. I believed him entirely. In 37 years of reading my brother, I had never heard him say something like that. Then, I said, I would suggest patience. I am not naturally patient, he said. No, I agreed. You are naturally efficient. Patient is different. He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. He went away. He was patient. He was so patient it was almost alarming, coming from a man who had managed the Ashcroft estate, a large and complex thing, with the kind of decisive velocity that had made certain neighbors slightly afraid of him. He called on Alara once a week through January, twice in February when the roads improved, and by March she was coming to Ashcroft Hall herself on occasion, her first visit, which I was present for, being a Tuesday afternoon in which she brought a book she had recommended to him and spent 2 hours arguing about it with him in the most satisfying way, with Agnes and me as completely irrelevant backdrop. In April, 6 months after the night at Brackenwall, he asked her. I was not there. I only know what he told me afterward, which was characteristically economical, that he had asked her in the garden at Aldermore, in the part where Thomas had planted an orchard that was beginning to come back to life after a year of neglect, and that she had said yes. What he did not tell me, and what I only pieced together later from small things, was this, that she had cried, not from distress, from something that is the opposite of distress, something that has the same feeling in the body but a different source. From the arrival, finally, of something she had not let herself want, because wanting it had seemed too much of a risk. Caspian had, by his account, given her his handkerchief. She had, by his account, told him that she was not generally a person who cried. He had told her he knew that. She had asked him if it changed anything. He had told her, and these were his words to me, which I believe he reproduced accurately, nothing in the world. He came home that evening and told me, with the economy that is his register for the things that matter most, that she had said yes. Then he went into the library and closed the door and, I believe, sat alone for a while in the particular way that one sits when something one has held very carefully for a very long time has finally been allowed to land. I did not disturb him. I went to bed early, and I lay awake for a considerable time in the pleasant state of a man who has watched something difficult resolve into something good, and who is aware that the resolution has been earned rather than given. In the weeks that followed, I watched my brother navigate the practical machinery of an engagement with the same efficiency he brought to everything, and also with something else. A lightness, infrequent but unmistakable, that I had not seen in him since he was perhaps 20, before the dukedom and all that the dukedom requires settled on him. He made decisions about the wedding with less of his usual deliberateness, and more of something that looked, in a man like Caspian, rather like impatience, though he would never have called it that. Alara came to Ashcroft Hall for the first time in February, for tea, which became dinner, which became a conversation that lasted until the candles in the drawing-room were low, during which she and my brother argued happily about 3 separate topics in a way that was the most genuine recreation I had seen either of them take in years. She left with her book. He had finished the annotations. She had the Cicero in her bag. They had apparently agreed to trade. And Caspian saw her to the carriage with the careful restraint of a man who is being very proper in a situation where proper is not precisely what he feels, and came back into the house with the expression of someone who has had an entirely satisfactory evening and does not intend to make a performance of that fact. I was waiting in the hall. He looked at me. "Not a word," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything," I said. "You were going to say several things," he said. "None of them." "Not a one," I agreed, entirely sincerely. They were married in June, at the small church in Thornbury Village, which is the church where every Ashcroft since the 3rd Duke has been baptized and buried and married, and which has a quality of settled permanence that a cathedral, for all its grandeur, cannot quite replicate. It is a building that does not pretend to be more than it is, old stone and clear glass and the particular smell of beeswax and good wood and thyme. I have always thought it the right kind of church for serious things. It was not a large wedding. Caspian had never been a man for spectacle, and Alara, who had had her feelings about large ceremonies rather complicated by the events of the previous year, had said, when asked, that she would be very happy with something quiet. Quiet in Ashcroft terms meant 50 guests and a wedding breakfast that lasted 4 hours, but there was no sneering gallery and no performance. It was simply the people who mattered and the words that mattered, said in the right order, in the right church, with the June light coming through the east window in a way that I have never seen the east window produce in any other season. There had been a question early in the planning of whether to invite certain people, county neighbors, parliamentary connections, a selection of Caspian's associates in London who would expect to be invited to a duke's wedding. My brother had considered this briefly, and then said, with perfect pleasantness, that he did not think they would find the occasion particularly interesting. This was his way of declining to make the ceremony a social event, and it was entirely characteristic of him. The people in the church on that June morning were people who had reason to be there, and the people who had reason to be there were not very many, and it was exactly right. I was standing beside my brother during the ceremony, which is the position that falls to the younger brother, and I could see both of them from where I stood. Alara walked in on the arm of an elderly cousin, a kind man from Shropshire, who had been one of the few people to treat her with ordinary decency in the months after Thomas's death, and she was wearing a white gown that was simple and very exactly right. Not elaborate, not excessive, simply itself, the way she was simply herself. Her hair was arranged with the same quiet care as always, a little loose at the temples, and she carried a small bunch of garden flowers that I recognized as coming from the Aldermore garden, the orchard garden, which Caspian had restored, rather than anything florist's, which was such a specific and private joke between them that I only understood it later. She had that quality I had first noticed in the drawing-room of Aldermore, the quality of stillness that was not resignation. But it was different now. It was settled. That was the word I kept returning to. She was settled in herself in a way she had not been in November, when it had cost her to be calm. She was settled in a way that was native rather than acquired, the way people are settled when they have been allowed to be at home in their own lives long enough to stop bracing for the next thing. She walked to the altar and looked at my brother, and he looked at her, and I have been at a great many weddings in my life, and I have never seen a look exchanged in quite that way. With the particular quality of two people who know what it costs to arrive at a thing and have arrived at it anyway, and are aware that the arriving matters more, not less, for the cost. My brother had worn the Ashcroft crest on his lapel pin, which is a thing he does only on formal occasions and which he does not make a show of. He had combed his hair with his usual precision, and he was wearing, I noticed, the charcoal coat he had bought in London the previous winter rather than the black one he wore for Parliament, which was a specific and deliberate choice that I was fairly certain Alara would also notice. She would know what it meant. She was very good at knowing what things meant. The words were said. The ring went on her finger, not taken from somewhere else, not given reluctantly, but placed there by my brother's own hand with the deliberateness he brings to everything he means, which is everything he does. I have seen him sign estate documents, sign letters, commit to positions in rooms full of powerful men who would have preferred he not, and he always looks the same when he does, exact and present and entirely certain. He looked like that when he placed the ring on her finger. He looked like that, and then he looked at her, and the exactness became something warmer. And she said his name, she said, Caspian, during the vows, not your grace, not the Duke. Just his name, which no one except I had called him since our mother died. And my brother, the most feared man in 3 counties, the most contained person I have known in my life, closed his eyes briefly in a way that I think he did not intend to be visible. It was visible, I saw it, I decided not to mention it. The vicar, who was a sensible man and had been the Thornbury vicar for 20 years and knew us both, pronounced them husband and wife with the same even warmth he brought to every ceremony. And there was a quiet ripple of feeling through the 50 people in the church that was not quite applause and not quite breath, and was entirely sufficient. The wedding breakfast was long and warm, and the summer garden was open, and Caspian moved through it with Alara beside him in the manner of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive, and is not, at this particular moment, planning to manage anything. I found them together near the end of the afternoon, standing at the edge of the garden where the lawn gives way to the old orchard, which Caspian had restored in the spring, a project he had undertaken in an apparently practical spirit that I was quite certain was not practical at all. The apple trees were in their summer leaf. The light was going long and gold. I stood at a distance and watched my brother lean toward his wife and say something I could not hear, and watched her turn to him with an expression that I do not have the right word for except to say it was the expression of a person who has been told something true and recognizes it. She reached up and put her hand briefly against his face. He was still. Then he turned his head and said something else, and she laughed, not her composed, careful laugh, but a real one. And he looked at her with the expression he only has in those moments when something surprises him into not being quite the Duke. I turned away and went back to the wedding breakfast, because there are things that are not mine to witness. The breakfast itself was long and warm. The summer day held, as June days in that part of England sometimes do, clear and dry with a light that has a quality of gold by mid-afternoon. The garden was open and the food was good, and there was dancing later in the long room off the hall, and I danced with Agnes Vane, who had been invited because Alara had said quietly that Agnes deserved to see something good happen, and Alara was right, and with the elderly cousin who had walked her down the aisle, and with one of Caspian's former secretaries who turned out to be an excellent dancer and had been concealing this quality for 4 years of employment. Caspian and Alara danced twice, which was precisely the correct number for the occasion, and the second time I watched them from the side of the room with a glass of something cold and thought about what a reliable thing it is that the most proper people, when they have found the right person, are capable of being perfectly improper in the ways that count. They danced correctly, entirely correctly. The room was watching, because the room always watches a duke and his new duchess, and they gave the room nothing to speak of on any technical ground. But they looked at each other while they danced the way I had watched them look at each other in the church, with the full weight of everything that had happened between November and now, and the room that was watching felt it, even the people who could not have said what they were feeling. This is what I set down 30 years later when my brother asked me once, unexpectedly, on a winter evening over a particularly good bottle of port, whether I remembered the night at Brackenwall. I remember all of it, I said. I walked 2 miles in sleet, he said. There was something in his voice that was very nearly complaint and was actually, I thought, fondness. You did, I said. I didn't mention it, he said. No, I agreed. You never do with the things that matter. He looked at me across the fireplace. His hair was gray now, had been gray for years, and he had the kind of face that age had made more precise rather than less. He was 69 years old and he was still, and I say this without reservation, the most formidable person I had ever sat in a room with. He managed the estate with the same surgical care. He had sat in Parliament for 30 years, and was known there as a man whose opinion on a bill was worth having precisely because he gave it so rarely. He had been, by most accounts that reached me, a fair and good landlord, a generous employer, and according to his wife, a man who still argued with her in the margins of books, now in a third color of ink since they had run out of room in 2. She mentioned it once, he said. Years ago. She said she had thought about it a great deal at the time, the letter from Hatch, and then my calling on her, and then being told the debts were gone. She said she had thought at first that it was a kindness someone might do out of obligation to a dead friend. And later, I said. He picked up his glass. Later, he said, she came to understand it differently. I looked at my brother. I thought of the night we had stood in Brackenwall's entrance hall in a gale, wet to the shoulder and smelling of November road, and of him bowing his head over her hands and saying, "You will not go back to that hall again." I had known in that moment that something had already been decided long before I arrived in France and Shropshire, that it had perhaps been decided in a drawing room somewhere years before, or in the particular quality of a dead man's friendship, or in the private inventory a careful man makes of himself when he is alone in the south of France for 6 weeks doing nothing visible. She was right, I said, about the second understanding. He looked at me. There was something in his face, fond, a little dry, and entirely unguarded in the way that he only ever was with family, and I think with her. Yes, he said, she was usually right. I raised my glass to him. He raised his to me. Outside, it was snowing, the first real snow of the year, coming down steady and clean past the library window. Inside, the fire was good, the port was excellent, and somewhere in the east wing of Ashcroft Hall, I knew, my brother's wife was reading in the room she had made her own in 30 years of making this place her home. A room she had reordered entirely and filled with books, and made into something that was not Ashcroft Hall in the way it had always been Ashcroft Hall, but something different, something lived in. He had walked 2 miles in sleet. She had been worth every step.